When I was retiring at 55, they laughed. My boss thought I was joking. My wife stared at me like I'd lost my mind. And honestly, maybe I had. Because the truth is, my savings aren't enough. My mortgage isn't paid off, and the math doesn't make sense. But yesterday, as I walked out of that office for the last time, I felt something I hadn't felt in years. Peace. Not relief, not excitement, just a deep, quiet peace, like I had finally stopped running from my own life. I know it sounds crazy, but maybe sometimes the smartest thing you can do is walk away before you have it all figured out. When I close my eyes now, the office fades and I'm back in the cheap folding chair at my son Evan's Little League field, shivering through a spring game because I promised one more conference call. I can still hear the crack of a bat and the hollow echo of missed presents. My name is Daniel Hayes, and for 33 years, I answered the same ringtone, replied to the same terse emails at midnight, and learned the language of meetings, KPIs, burn rates, synergy, better than I knew the faces on my own kitchen table. I remember the promotion that came with a bonus I could never spend because it required more travel. And I remember the nights the house was quiet except for my laptop and the faint blue light of a spreadsheet that measured my life in incremental growth. There's a peculiar gravity to that kind of work. It promises security and status, but it also asks for pieces of you in exchange. Anniversaries eaten at a desk, holidays abbreviated so you can catch up, birthdays sent in a hurried text. I don't say this to indict anyone. I lived it by choice, nurtured it like a plant I thought would feed my future. It did, in a way. It paid tuition. It kept a roof over our heads. It bought me a house that smelled like cedar and responsibility. But it also taught me how to postpone living. I've learned the vocabulary of compromise. I learned to be proud of being practical, of shelving a guitar I played in college because it wasn't a productive use of time. I learned to tell myself that security would compensate for loss, that someday I'd have time for the porch, for slow mornings, for long conversations that don't end with, "I gotta go." The trouble is, someday kept changing its date. My daughter, Claire, graduated and moved 2 states away. I missed one of the handful of times she sang in choir because of a quarterly review. Those small absences accumulate until they feel like a different life entirely. Standing on my porch this morning with a mug that still had my wife's lipstick on the rim from when she kissed me goodbye, I felt the weight of those absences in a way I hadn't let myself feel in years. There are facts that sit at the back of every practical mind. Pensions are vanishing, Social Security might not cover everything, and the idea of enough is a shifting target. I thought I had mapped it. Savings accounts, a 401k that grew with market cycles, plans for refinancing. But numbers have a way of surprising you, and priorities have a way of exposing what the numbers can't measure. The ache I felt wasn't only financial, it was more existential. What did I actually have to show for the decades of giving up small joys for future stability? Was I richer in experience or just in thing ownership? That question kept me awake more nights than any spreadsheet. So I began to inventory differently, not how much net worth I could claim, but what quiet moments I'd traded away. I thought about the look on my mother's face the last time I visited. She died 2 years ago, and I had postponed a trip until after the audit. And I thought about the sound of my son's laughter in the hallway when he was little, and the way Claire's hands used to lace through mine. Those memories weren't line items on a balance sheet, but they were the reasons I eventually put my resignation letter on the boss's desk.
This section of my life is not a tidy admission of victory or defeat. It's the start of a reckoning. And if you're listening and you've spent a lifetime doing the practical thing, you know that reckoning can be terrifying and clarifying at once. What I didn't know then, and what I was both excited and afraid to learn, was whether stepping away would mend the quiet places I'd left broken, or leave me exposed to the very real consequences of walking without a net. I remember the moment the numbers stopped being abstract and started feeling like a conversation I hadn't been invited to. I sat at the kitchen table with 3 stacks of paper: the latest 401k statement, the mortgage amortization my bank sent after I asked about refinancing, and a printout showing projected Social Security benefits. The ink on the pages might as well have been a judge's handwriting. I felt 60 in a body that was 55, as if the years of later had finally arrived to collect their dues. The truth was blunt. My savings were thinner than I'd comforted myself into believing. Investments had taken hits at inconvenient times, and the house I loved carried a mortgage that didn't forgive sentiment. I had made choices, some wise, some hurried, and now they all had to live on the same table. Let me be honest about the mistakes, because men listening to this should hear them plainly. I postponed aggressive saving when my salary surged because I told myself I'll catch up next year. I assumed the company would always offer a generous match and didn't diversify enough when the market looked unstoppable. I treated health insurance like a checkbox, paying for the policy, not studying the gaps. And I also misjudged housing, buying a bigger place because it felt successful without fully mapping the long-term carrying costs. These are practical errors, not moral failures, but their consequences are practical too. Higher fixed monthly costs, less flexibility, and a smaller cushion when the unexpected arrives. Here's where the planning part became urgent. I made a new list that night, not a dream list, but a triage list. First, I called the Human Resources Department and asked the kind of boring, specific questions men usually avoid. When can I claim Social Security without penalty? What are the specifics of my 401k withdrawal rules? And what COBRA or bridge insurance options would cover me until Medicare eligibility? The answers were blunt and bureaucratic, but they gave me a calendar of decisions. Knowledge turned dread into work. Second, I built a revised monthly budget. No more vague hopes. I listed fixed expenses, potential downsizing savings, and a range for unpredictable costs like health or car repairs. There's also a truth many won't say out loud. Pride makes numbers worse. I clung to a standard of living that people expected of me. Dinners out, big vacations, the lawn that looked perfect, because I thought leaving those things would feel like defeat. But pruning those things didn't feel like failure. It felt like reclaiming margin. I sold a second car, stopped paying for 2 streaming services I never used, and started negotiating property taxes with a neighbor's referral to a local advisor. Every small, honest reduction in cost was less dramatic than I imagined and more freeing than I thought possible. Facing the numbers didn't give me certainty. It did, however, give me choices. Small, sometimes ugly, sometimes wise. I learned to treat finances like a conversation you enter early, asking questions, not a verdict to receive at the end. If you're still deciding when to retire, or you've already pulled the pin like I did, this part of the story matters. The math will always push back, but planning lets you change the terms of the conversation. That night, with coffee gone cold and the papers stacked into a tidy folder, I felt less betrayed by numbers and more in control of what questions I would answer next.
There comes a point in every man's life when logic runs out of arguments and all that's left is a quiet voice asking, When are you finally going to live? I heard that voice one Thursday evening, sitting in my car in the office parking lot. The sunset was bleeding over the hood, the same sky I'd ignored 1,000 times before. I was supposed to go back inside and finish a report that could have easily waited until morning, but something inside me refused. It wasn't rebellion, it was exhaustion with pretending that the next promotion, the next raise, the next someday would make it all worth it. That night, I decided to retire, numbers be damned. And I'll be honest, it wasn't a cinematic moment of victory. It was quiet, uncertain, and terrifying. Because men like me, we've been taught to measure our worth by productivity. Stopping felt like erasing part of my identity. But here's what most people don't tell you. When your body starts whispering about stress before your mind admits it, it's already too late to negotiate. My blood pressure had been creeping up for years. Sleep was something I managed, not experienced. I had more meetings on my calendar than meaningful conversations in my life. When I finally told Maggie, my wife, that I wanted out, she didn't argue. She just looked at me with that mix of relief and concern that only someone who's watched you burn out can show. Dan, I'd rather have a smaller bank account than lose you early. That hit harder than any spreadsheet ever could. I started thinking about all the men I'd known who waited for the right time. Some of them never got there. A coworker, Jim, postponed his retirement twice to pad his savings. He died of a heart attack 3 months before his final date. Another, Rick, retired at 65 with a strong portfolio but no idea what to do with his days. Within a year, he was back consulting because the silence scared him. I didn't want that. I didn't want to trade all my healthy years for a guarantee I might never live to enjoy. If you're listening and you're in that in-between space, half planning, half doubting, remember this. Sometimes the cost of waiting is higher than the risk of beginning. Of course, there was fear. Retiring without perfect numbers feels like jumping from a plane while still stitching your parachute mid-air. But I planned what I could control. I built a 12-month spending projection, cut unnecessary costs, and created a side safety net by renting out the basement suite we never used. Maggie and I agreed to test 1 year of this new life, see how it felt, see what it taught us. We called it the Freedom Experiment. The funny part, the moment I stopped chasing stability, I actually started building it. The stress that once clouded my judgment began to clear, and clarity made room for creativity. When I handed in my resignation, my boss looked stunned. "You're too young to quit," he said. And maybe by corporate standards I was, but by life standards, I was right on time. The next morning, when I walked out with a box of my things, no grand farewell or gold watch, just a few nods and quiet goodbyes, I didn't feel like I was leaving a job. I felt like I was reclaiming a self I'd buried under deadlines. That was the day I stopped living to make a living and started learning how to simply live. The first week felt like a city after a blackout. Familiar streets, but the traffic lights that once told me when to move had all gone dark, and for the first time, I had to decide my own pace. Day 1, I slept until 8 and felt triumphant. Day 2, I woke up at 5 with a panicked scramble to find purpose. By day 3, the novelty began to thin, and a quiet boredom seeped in that I hadn't expected. I had pictured goosebumps of freedom and long cinematic mornings. What I hadn't pictured was the weird hollow pause between the end of the office and the beginning of the rest of my life. It felt honest and dangerous at all once. I remember making a list, because that's what men like me do when we're afraid. Lists quiet the mind. I split it into 3 columns: practical, pleasure, and experiment. Practical was boring but necessary. Call the insurance agent to confirm COBRA end dates and how Medicare lines up when it's time, schedule a physical because I kept putting it off, and set up an automatic transfer to my emergency fund so I couldn't forget to save. Pleasure held smaller nervous entries: sit with Maggie on the porch for breakfast, walk the dog without rushing, pull the old Martin acoustic from the closet and play the chord I'd always avoided. Experiment was my permission to try things that might flop. Teach a week-long workshop at the community college. drive for a rideshare on busy weekends, or start a small landscaping gig with Gary down the block who'd always needed an extra hand. There was real learning in those first 7 days. I discovered my stress had a shape. It inhaled when I was idle and exhaled when I had a small, meaningful task. So I learned to structure the day with micro-commitments: 1 hour of reading, 45 minutes of physical activity, 30 minutes of email to keep my head in the world without letting work replace me. Boredom wasn't a moral failing, it was a signal. It told me which rhythms I'd been missing. Men in the audience who are planning their exit should take note. Retirement without routine is just extended uncertainty. You don't need a job to have purpose, but you do need a scaffold to build it on. Mistakes found me then as well. I overcommitted to a volunteer project in the third hour of enthusiasm and had to apologize when I couldn't keep up. I also forgot to account for additional small expenses: lawn service when I used to do it myself, an extra medical copay, things that compound quietly. That's practical. Small leaks sink boats. So I fixed them fast. Cut a subscription I never used, handed over the lawn to Gary for a month, and put a placeholder line in the budget for unexpected costs. Each correction felt like assembling a safety net while I walked a tightrope. Emotionally, the week was a collage of relief and grief. Relief because migraines diminished and my sleep deepened, but grief because I realized how many moments I'd outsourced to one day. I sat with Maggie and cried once over nothing and everything, over a missed recital, over the sound of my son's voice in a voicemail, over a memory of my mother washing dishes as I came home late. Those tears were not defeat. They were the theft being returned. To the men listening, don't be surprised when sorrow and gratitude sit next to each other at your kitchen table. They're part of this work. By the end of the week, I'd built a tentative routine and a few experiments that felt promising. I didn't have answers for every fear, but I had momentum. And in retirement, momentum is often more useful than certainty.
The morning I realized I'd been blind to ordinary joy was the morning I walked past the mailbox and actually noticed the maple tree's leaves catching the sunlight in a way I hadn't seen in years. I stopped, took a breath, and felt stupid for not having stopped before. Stupid in the way a man feels when he finally admits he's been prioritizing appearances over living. In those first months after my resignation, the big gestures didn't matter as much as the tiny, steady ones. The smell of fresh coffee on the porch at 7, the way the newspaper sat heavy on my lap like a small, reliable anchor, the slow, honest conversations with Maggie about what really made us laugh when the kids were small. I started waking early by habit, not by panic, and took that hour to walk the neighborhood. No earbuds, no podcasts about productivity, just the sound of tires on wet pavement and the neighbor's dog barking 2 houses down. Physically, the walk helped. My doctor later told me that even moderate daily walking can reduce blood pressure and improve sleep, facts I'd ignored while busy chasing raises. But emotionally, it was the best prescription I'd never been given. Movement replaced the anxious loop of what if with a forward motion that felt like progress without a ledger. I learned to keep a pocket journal and jot a line about one good thing each morning, no matter how small, because gratitude, when practiced like a muscle, builds resilience. There were lessons and mistakes in these joys too. I romanticized slow afternoons until I underplanned them, expecting contentment to arrive simply because the calendar had blank pages. That was a mistake many retirees make, believing freedom itself will be filling. It took deliberate choices to make those moments meaningful. I scheduled regular breakfasts with old coworkers turned friends, not to relive the grind, but to swap stories. I signed up for a small woodworking class at the community center to learn how to shape something that wasn't a quarterly deliverable. I started a monthly poker night with 3 guys from the neighborhood. No stakes, just the ritual of competition and easy laughter. These were experiments I allowed myself, and some flopped. A gardening club I joined dissolved after 2 meetings because everyone wanted it to be either professional or social and couldn't settle on both. And a weekend trip I planned alone felt lonelier than I expected until I invited my sister on the second attempt and realized travel was better when shared. Each failed trial taught me something practical: how to vet groups, how to set boundaries, and how to budget time and money for pleasure. For men listening who are planning their exit or have already pulled the trigger, hear this. Simple pleasures aren't free. They require intention and sometimes small investment. I had to reallocate part of the budget I once used for business lunches toward a modest gym membership, a used bicycle, and occasional theater tickets. Those line items read like luxuries on paper, but they functioned as anchors for my well-being. Socially, I fought an old instinct to isolate, to prove that I could be self-sufficient. Instead, I learned to invite, to accept help when needed, and to be honest about the fact that close friendships require maintenance. The accumulation of tiny, consistent joys built a new architecture of days that, over time, felt sturdier than any portfolio. By the time summer settled in, the thing I bragged about, not at dinners, but to myself, wasn't a number on a statement. It was that I could sit through a long sunset without checking my phone, that laughter came easier, and that I could finally name, without shame, what I'd been missing all those years. If I'm honest, the list of small regrets reads like a grocery receipt of things I thought I could pick up later. Learning to cook a decent meal for Maggie so we could laugh at burnt edges together, finally patching up the cold distance with my brother Robert before it hardened into silence, and writing down where the insurance documents and passwords actually lived instead of assuming someone would figure it out. Those are not dramatic confessions, but they cut the deepest because they were avoidable. For a lot of us men, there's this stubborn belief that time is an endless account we can withdraw from later. The lesson I learned, bruising and practical, is that time isn't a bank with an infinite line of credit. It's a ledger with irreversible entries, and the small omissions compound until they shape the rest of your life. I began to catalog those mistakes, not to punish myself, but to make a concrete to-do list for the years ahead. Medical advance directives completed, a simple will drafted with an attorney my neighbor recommended, and a tidy folder of digital passwords and account logins labeled plainly in the top drawer for Maggie to find. Practical, small fixes that remove drama later. There are factual realities that turned regret into action. Healthcare is not a theory for men approaching retirement, it's a daily variable. I'd seen friends assume they'd be fine until a small health snag turned into a multi-thousand-dollar emergency. So I scheduled the screenings I've been postponing and finally understood the gap between being insured and being covered. I also read up on tax strategies that retirees overlook, how small withdrawals taken at the wrong time can bump you into a higher tax bracket, how Roth conversions can be a useful tool when planned carefully. And I sat down with a certified planner to make those choices deliberate, not emotional. That meeting felt like changing lanes with the blinker on, slower, intentional, and ultimately safer. Emotionally, acceptance looked less like surrender and more like permission. Accepting that I had missed things didn't mean I was defeated. It meant I could still choose the shape of my remaining time. I called Robert and asked him for coffee. Not to rehash old fights, but to say the things we'd both been too proud to say. We talked about fatherhood, about how our father's silence taught us both to avoid uncomfortable conversations, and we laughed thinking about the ridiculous hats Dad had worn to Thanksgiving. That conversation didn't fix decades of distance in one sitting, but it began the repair. For men listening who fear vulnerability, let me tell you, the hardest words you can say are often the ones that unlock the rest of your life. There were planning lessons too. Diversify income sources, yes, but also diversify meaning. I added consulting hours that used my experience but left me room to breathe. I set a modest contingency fund equal to 6 months of essential expenses, and I started a habit of weekly check-ins with Maggie about money, not to control each other, but to stay aligned. Mistakes taught me humility. Asking for help from a financial counselor didn't mean I'd failed, it meant I was serious about living well. If there's a single practical takeaway from this stretch of life, it's that regrets can be converted. You can inventory your losses, make rapid, specific fixes, and give the rest of your life a better chance at being lived well. And in the quiet that follows, you'll find the strange, stubborn joy of having learned how to spend your days with intention.
The first serious conversation I had after retirement wasn't about budgets or health plans. It was with Evan in the garage, where he was fixing his old Camaro, grease under his nails, and that same stubborn jaw I remember from when he was 5. We'd always been good at logistics, who picks up who pays for what, but terrible at the hard, awkward talks men put off because they think emotion is a sign of weakness. I told him plainly that I'd missed things I couldn't get back. First games, school plays, late-night talks when he needed advice and I answered with an email instead. He shoved a rag into his back pocket and, without looking up, said, "You were always there in the way that paid the bills, Dad. I just wish you'd been there in the way that showed up." That line landed like a brick, and it taught me the difference between presence and presence that's on paper. From that day, I started prioritizing calls and visits the same way I used to prioritize meetings, putting them in my calendar, respecting them, and treating family time as non-negotiable. Maggie and I had to relearn how to be partners instead of colleagues sharing a house. Money talk with a spouse is one of those assassination-style conversations, slow, messy, and precise. We laid everything out aloud: the retirement accounts, the mortgage balance, the contingency fund, and the small monthly luxuries we could afford to keep. We made decisions together about downsizing options, about whether to tap into investments and when, and about how much of the house to keep for family visits. There were practical moves, updating beneficiaries, talking to an estate attorney, and creating an accessible folder of critical documents, but the emotional work was deeper. Apologizing for missed birthdays, admitting where pride had made we stubborn, and listening when Maggie admitted she'd been lonely some nights even when I was home. Those confessions were not convenient, they were necessary. There's a fact I learned that isn't often spoken at company retreats. Spending time with loved ones isn't just emotionally beneficial, it's physiologically protective. Men who maintain close family relationships after retirement tend to report lower rates of depression and better cardiovascular health. Facts that finally made sense when I started sleeping better and noticing my migraines ease. So I scheduled ritualized connection. Sunday dinners with Evan and Claire when they were in town. Weekly FaceTime with my daughter so she'd stop calling only when she needed something. And a monthly check-in with my sister Laura, who kept reminding me of the nonsense Dad used to say over coffee. Rituals changed the tenor of our family from transactional to relational. But I also had to set boundaries. My brother Robert, whose idea of support was offering advice about my spending, needed to understand the difference between concern and control. I learned to say no to financial help that came with strings and to accept help that came without judgment. Mistakes were made. I once agreed to co-sign a loan for a cousin and regretted it when payments lagged and resentment crept in. That was a hard lesson about where generosity ends and enabling begins. I repaired those harms by being honest, renegotiating terms, and sometimes walking away when necessary. For men listening who are planning this shift, here's a practical move.
Have a family budget meeting that's short, factual, and focused on aligning values rather than blaming numbers. Make a plan for caregiving expectations. Who's likely to step in if health issues arise, and document it. And equally important, make a list of non-negotiables that aren't money. Friday night dinners, one-on-one time with each child, or a yearly trip that anchors everyone. The payoff isn't just sentimental, it's a durable, quiet insurance policy for your later years. In the end, as I learned sitting at that greasy workbench with Evan, the richest balance sheet is the one that reflects the people you didn't miss. Rebuilding relationships isn't glamorous, but it's the kind of practical work that pays interest for the rest of your life. The first time somebody said it to my face, "Are you crazy?" was in the men's locker room at the country club, of all places. I'd been there for a casual round with Frank and a couple of guys I'd shared quarterly dinners with for years. The joke started as ribbing. "You're retiring at 55? What, you lost your nerve?" But their laughter landed like a landing strip light. Bright, public, and impossible to ignore. For a second, I felt the old corporate reflex: defend, justify, exceed. I pulled a joke back about early golf perks and laughed too loud. But later that night, the chuckle tasted like ash. Men are taught to be steady and to shoulder the load. In many places, leaving work early reads as abandoning duty or losing competence. That cultural pressure is real, and it finds you in conversations you think are casual. There are facts behind that feeling. Society still measures masculinity in productivity. Who provides, who sacrifices, who keeps the household afloat. That isn't an abstract observation, it's a pressure that shapes choices. I'd heard from a former colleague who delayed retirement because of what his neighbors would say. He told me he felt trapped by the idea of being the man who gave up. Another friend, Tom, who retired early to run a small B&B, confided that he'd lost several male friends who couldn't reconcile his new pace with the image they'd long held of him. That kind of social friction surprised me, until it didn't. People's expectations are often less about your well-being than about preserving the story they've told about you. So I learned a few practical tactics. First, manage the narrative. I practiced a short, firm answer so conversations wouldn't become a referendum on my decision. "I'm testing a year of different priorities," or "We're choosing health and presence now," were enough to stop follow-ups without sounding defensive. Second, prepare the facts. Men respect competence. Showing that I'd done the math, albeit imperfectly, and had contingency plans calmed many critics. I'd brought with me the one-year budget we'd made, the basement rental arrangement, and the consulting gigs I'd lined up. When Frank saw I wasn't reckless, his tone shifted from mockery to curiosity. That small demonstration of planning is a leverage point. It doesn't remove judgment, but it reframes it. Mistakes happened. I made the error of oversharing the doubts early, saying things like, "I don't know if this is smart," to anyone who asked. That gave people permission to preach. Humility is necessary, but you don't have to invite unsolicited verdicts. I also tried to prove my decision by buying into performative status markers, an expensive watch, a refurbished sports car, thinking it would quiet gossip. It didn't. Those gestures only polished the outside while leaving the inside hollow. The fix was to stop performing and start living deliberately, showing rather than proving what this life meant for me and Maggie. There are also institutional expectations. Employers, banks, even friends sometimes assume retirement follows a tidy path. Full savings, clear benefits, a pension check. When you don't follow that path, their scripts don't fit, and they react. I discovered helpful allies in unexpected places. A local men's group at the library, a retirement workshop at the community college, and a financial counselor who'd worked with early retirees. Men listening, find communities that model different scripts. You don't have to defend your choice to everyone, just to those whose opinion matters. Emotionally, facing society's expectations taught me to tolerate discomfort. Shame likes company. It gets quieter when you name it and keep moving. The hardest part was losing some casual friendships that were built on shared identities I no longer wanted. That hurt. But the friendships that mattered adapted, deepened, or were replaced by people who chose the same values. In the end, standing firm wasn't about being stubborn, it was about aligning my days with what I finally valued: health, presence, and time well spent. And when I could say that without apology, the locker room laughs stopped sounding like verdicts and started sounding like background noise.
If there's one thing no one warns you about retirement, it's the silence. The first few weeks, that silence feels like peace. Then it starts echoing. You wake up one morning, make coffee, and realize you have nowhere to be. No deadlines, no emails, no calls waiting on hold. For a man who spent 3 decades measuring his worth in productivity, that silence can feel like failure. I remember one morning in March, Maggie had gone to her yoga class, the house was spotless, and the TV felt like background noise. I sat there wondering if I'd made a mistake, not financially, but emotionally. Maybe I'd built my life too tightly around work to know who I was without it. That's when I realized something. Retirement isn't about not working. It's about reworking your purpose. So I started with something small. Every morning, I forced myself to go for a 6:30 a.m. walk, just like I used to get ready for office. I didn't check my phone, no podcasts, no news, just me, the street, and my thoughts. At first, I hated it. My mind was restless, craving distraction. But after a week, I started noticing things. Neighbors I'd never met before. A kid practicing basketball shots before school. Even the smell of fresh-cut grass that I somehow missed for years. The world hadn't slowed down. I had. Then I created what I call my retirement map, a schedule that gave my week structure, but without the corporate rigidity. Mondays became my project days, where I worked on personal goals, fixing the old shed, learning basic carpentry, updating the family photo albums. Wednesdays, I volunteered at a local community kitchen for 3 hours. Not for praise, but because serving coffee to someone who can't afford it gives you perspective money never could. Fridays were for old friendships. I'd meet an old colleague, catch up over lunch, and talk about something other than business. Slowly, the fog started to lift. But here's the real learning I want to share with you guys watching. You have to replace purpose before you remove pressure. Many men retire thinking they'll find happiness automatically, but nature hates a vacuum. If you don't fill your days with something meaningful, old regrets and restlessness will crawl right back in. One of the biggest mistakes I made early on was overloading my calendar with random hobbies just to stay busy. I signed up for golf, woodworking, and even a photography class, and quit half of them within weeks. I realized busyness wasn't the goal. Fulfillment was. And fulfillment, I found, often hides in small, consistent habits, not grand reinventions. So I made a simple rule. Do 3 things every day that keep you healthy, connected, and curious. For me, that meant a morning walk, a phone call to someone I care about, and learning one new thing, whether it's a recipe, a book, or a skill. Within months, my days felt grounded again. The anxiety faded. The silence became comforting, not haunting. For anyone planning retirement or already in it, remember your identity isn't tied to your job title. It's built on what you give your time, energy, and attention to. Replace the rush with rhythm, and purpose will quietly find its way back into your mornings. If retirement were a movie, it would have some quiet, golden scenes, and then a sudden pulled camera to the face to remind you
life still surprises. For me, that surprise came like a cough I ignored until it wasn't just a cough. One autumn morning, I felt a tightness in my chest after mowing the lawn. I shrugged it off. Just a son of a bad workout, I told myself, until Maggie insisted I see the doctor. The diagnosis was nothing cinematic, an arrhythmia that needed monitoring and a medication change. It wasn't a death sentence, but it was the kind of medical hitch that throws a tight wrench into a carefully folded plan. Men listening, we are notoriously bad at paying attention to small symptoms. I delayed an appointment out of pride and schedule thinking, and that delay cost me sleep and added stress that could have been avoided. Financial hiccups turned up their heads too. The basement tenant, who'd been a steady earner, called to say he'd lost his job and needed time before rent. I'd counted on that income when I mapped the first year, and suddenly the spreadsheet I had been proud of looked optimistic. There were also unexpected repairs. The old furnace that had survived 3 winters finally failed, and replacing it ran well into 4 figures. Those small, sharp expenses are the kind that make you realize how fragile a plan is when it's tight. Mistakes I made here were predictable and preventable. I'd underestimated the volatility of rental income, and I didn't keep a fully funded emergency account at a level that felt safe when the real shocks came. So what did I do? First, I stopped pretending stoicism was the same as silence. I told Maggie the truth about the numbers and the feelings. That's step 1 for preserving both sanity and partnership. Then I got practical. I bumped the emergency fund to a level equal to 6 months of essential expenses, not because it's a magic number, but because having a buffer changed the tone of decisions from panic to management. I contacted the tenant and negotiated a temporary rent reduction while he searched for work, and I reached out to a local HVAC company recommended by a neighbor to get a reasonable quote rather than the first expensive bid. Small hustles followed. I picked up a freelance consulting weekend and sold a couple of tools I never used. None of it was glamorous, but it worked. The lesson? Reliability is more valuable than pride. Health planning received its own overhaul. I enrolled in a heart monitoring program my doctor suggested, updated my medication list, and scheduled preventative screenings I'd delayed. I also updated advanced directives and shared them with Maggie and our adult children, not because we expect the worst, but to prevent confusion if something happens. There's nothing macho about avoiding paperwork. It's practical love. Emotionally, these challenges tested me. There were nights I felt small and useless, bargaining with if-only thinking. Pride made me want to hide the hiccups, but vulnerability saved us time and money. When I admitted I needed help, friends stepped in with contractor recommendations, and an old colleague offered a short contract that covered a month's of expenses. Community matters. That's a fact that shows up in real life. Resilience is rarely solo work. For men in the audience either planning retirement or already living it, take this as both a warning and a roadmap. Expect bumps. Maintain a buffer. Vet rental income conservatively. Keep up with health screenings and never let small symptoms sit for weeks. Have a clear, accessible file of documents and emergency contacts. Most importantly, talk to the people that matter before a crisis forces the conversation. The point isn't to scare you. It's to prepare you so surprise becomes manageable, not catastrophic. When life pulled that camera to my face, I learned that steady planning plus willingness to pivot keeps the story moving forward.
After the furnace broke and the tenant shorted a month, after the doctor's appointment and the tense budget talks at the kitchen table, something quieter began to happen. My confidence came back. Not because the market rebounded or the rent was paid, but because I started doing things that proved I still mattered. I took on small projects that used the skills I'd spent 30 years polishing: organizing, planning, mentoring. And those tiny wins built momentum. I started coaching a youth baseball team at the local rec center 2 evenings a week, not because I had a plan to become an expert coach, but because teaching Evan's old fundamentals to new kids reminded me I could still lead without the title of manager. There's a fact behind that feeling. Volunteering has measurable health benefits, including reduced depression and better physical function for older adults. And it also reconnects you to community, which is as much a retirement asset as any financial instrument. Practical moves followed the emotional work. I set up an informal office hours schedule at the community college for local small business owners to come by with bookkeeping questions I could help with. The cash was modest, but the real return was intellectual. Using my brain in a lower stakes, higher meaning way felt like exercise for my sense of usefulness. I also began a multi-step plan for legacy. A simple letter to each of my children about the lessons I'd learned, a basic estate plan I updated with an attorney, the simple will, plus a durable power of attorney, and a home inventory that made it easier for Maggie to manage things if I wasn't around. Those were practical, adult moves, boring, honest, necessary. And they calmed more anxieties than any app ever could. Mistakes were still part of the curriculum. I tried to scale up too fast once, agreeing to a speaking event in a town 3 hours away without checking Maggie's schedule. She was supposed to meet a friend that weekend and rightly called it out. I learned the hard way that rebuilding confidence shouldn't mean returning to the old pattern of prioritizing external validation over shared rhythms at home. Another mistake was underestimating the tax consequences of a small Roth conversion I attempted without talking to my CPA. The bill arrived and reminded me that every financial move still needs a careful eye. Both errors were teachable. Slow down, check the calendar, loop in the professionals, and keep Maggie in the decision loop. I also learned to be deliberate about how I shared my story. Men listening, your story has power, but how you tell it matters. I started a small blog, plain, honest posts about small wins and practical fixes. I didn't aim for followers, I aimed for clarity. Writing those posts forced me to translate emotional lessons into actionable steps. How I renegotiated a basement rental. How I set up a basic emergency fund. How I scheduled preventative medical appointments. Turning experience into guidance was a confidence multiplier. It made my setbacks useful to others and gave shape to my days. Finally, looking forward meant accepting that plans change. I kept a flexible 5-year goal list rather than a rigid retirement manifesto. Some items were financial. Pay down a little more mortgage, save for a short trip to Yellowstone, while others were personal. Learn to play a full song on the Martin, take a painting class, organize one big family reunion. That balance between money and meaning kept me honest. The truth I want to leave with you, men, listening who are either planning or have already stepped off the ladder, rebuilding confidence is incremental. It's built on small, repeatable acts that prove to yourself you still have value beyond a job title. Those acts add up into a life you can look at without regret. Even if the numbers never quite match the ideal you once imagined.
And if there's a closing chord to this long, messy piece of my life, it sounds simple. Numbers matter, but they do not get to write the whole story. After months of budgeting, doctor's visits, awkward conversations, small hustles, and nights when I woke up wondering if I'd wrecked our future, a quiet truth kept returning to me like a stubborn hymn. I was learning to value the ledger of lived moments over the ledger of liquid assets. That didn't mean I became reckless or stopped respecting planning. It meant I finally understood that planning was a tool to support living, not a bar to be judged by before you could begin. The practical moves were still there. Meet with a planner, maintain an emergency fund, vet rental tenants as if your sanity depends on it, but they became servants to a higher aim, to have days that felt like they belonged to me. I started measuring retirement in breakfasts shared with Maggie, in a baseball game where I didn't take a single call, in a small poem I scrawled in a notebook because the sentence felt true, not marketable. Those entries don't boost a net worth, but they compound in a different, quieter way. Mistakes continued, because life is stubborn like that. I over-optimized the first year, cutting too much from entertainment and finding myself surprisingly resentful. I underinsured one small appliance and learned to keep a small maintenance fund. I let pride delay asking for help when paperwork overwhelmed me. Each error taught a practical correction. Be generous with time that heals, conservative with assumptions about passive income, and precise about paperwork so your partner isn't left deciphering chaos. There is a fact here for men who like facts. Resilience is a mixture of foresight and humility. Build buffers, financial, social, and physical, and be humble enough to use them. Pride makes problems private. Planning makes them manageable. Emotionally, the final lesson was less about formulas and more about permission. I gave myself permission to be imperfect, to enjoy mornings without feeling like I'd failed the previous evening's KPI. I permissioned Maggie and myself to try new things even if they failed. We booked a fishing trip that got rained out and laughed about how thoroughly unskilled we were, and that laugh felt like practice for grace. I allowed my friendships to change shape. Some deepened, some thinned, and I accepted that losing an audience of approvers was part of gaining an audience of equals. The most honest conversations I had were the ones where I admitted fear first, then asked for help. That kind of vulnerability is not weakness. It's a practical strategy for staying anchored when the winds pick up. For those of you still weighing the leap, plan rigorously, yes, but don't let the perfect spreadsheet be the gatekeeper of your life. Talk to your partner like your future depends on the conversation, because it does. Get the health checks. Build a small, realistic side income if you can. Keep an emergency fund that feels like breathing room, not an optimal statistic. And when you step off the ladder, step forward into curiosity. Volunteer, mentor, learn a craft. Travel with a plan that's affordable, but not tiny. The final lesson I want to carve into the corner of this story is this: freedom without intention can become loneliness. Money without meaning can become a number you resent. But when planning and purpose meet, they make a life that's both sensible and vivid. So, I keep my old spreadsheets and my new routines, my mistakes logged and my small joys counted. I don't regret the years I spent building security. I did what many of us were taught to do. But I don't worship those years either. I've started spending them. And that turning, choosing experience over exactitude, has been the clearest